4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live. It's Lichtman Live. Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, welcome to our very brilliant, savvy audience. We're going to talk today about lies, and videotapes. Maybe a good title for a movie, huh? Throw a little sex in.
Wow, you're up on your movie titles, huh?
I am.
Yes, we will be talking a lot about lies, and videos. You know, it's interesting. When I first saw that, I remember sitting, eating lunch, seeing that Renee Good video and thinking, oh, here's another George Floyd moment. Here's another video in the American zeitgeist that is going to be watched and scrutinized over and over and over again. And that has certainly been what has happened over the last week or so.
You're right on, Sam.
Before we get into our topics tonight, I want to thank tonight's sponsor, which is Aura. Here is a message from them.
Let me tell you something that should alarm all of us. I recently Googled my name and email address. What came up? Dozens of data broker sites claiming to sell my personal information, phone number, address history, even the names of my relatives. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry you never signed up for. Data brokers harvest your information without consent, then sell it to marketers, scammers, and yes, even political operatives. And while they're legally obligated to remove it if you ask, they make the process so confusing and tedious that most people just give up. That's why I use Aura. Aura identifies which broker sites are selling your info, automatically requests removal on your behalf, and follows up to make sure your data stays gone. But Aura goes far beyond that. It's real, all-in-one digital protection. You get alerts if your personal data is found on the dark web. Real-time fraud monitoring for your credit and banking accounts. A secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and more. And if something goes wrong, you're backed by $5 million in identity theft insurance with U.S.-based fraud support available 24/7. And here's the most important part. Aura offers more features than any other service at its price. So while companies like TransUnion lose control of your data, Aura helps you take it back. Try Aura free for 14 days. Aura.com/Allan Lichtman. That's enough time for Aura to start scrubbing your personal info off these broker sites without you lifting a finger. I'm not leaving myself vulnerable, and you shouldn't either.
All right, thank you to our sponsor tonight, Aura. Back to today's show. The Renee Good ice shooting video has been scrutinized by the entire country, and we're starting to get some feedback on the sentiment across America. A new poll finds a majority of Americans say the deadly ice shooting of Renee Good in Minneapolis was unjustified. That was Kiko.
Kiko agrees.
Yeah.
All right. Before we get into the polling data, which prove they're not fooling anyone, I want to scrutinize what Trump and Vance and Noam have said about this tragedy. And I'm going to give you something on the order of 10 reasons, Sam. Not one, not two, but close to 10 reasons why they are blatantly lying, trying to deceive you and me and the rest of the American people. I will also point out lying by ICE officials and Trump officials. Guess what?
What?
It's as common as the sunshine.
Wow.
It happens all the time, including an incident very much in parallel with what happened in Minneapolis. We're also going to give you an on-the-scene report from a prominent resident of Minneapolis, Greg Belanger, former Teacher of the Year in Minnesota and in the Central States. But first, let's not forget the instant knee-jerk reaction of Trump and Noam, the head of DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and Vice President Vance. Before even all the facts were in, they had this knee-jerk response, and even as more and more information has come out, they have only doubled down on it. President Trump said, quote, "The woman driving the car was very disorderly, obstructing, and resisting. Then she violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer who seems to have shot her in self-defense." He went on to say, based on the attached clip, it is hard to believe that he is alive, but is now recovering in the hospital. Secretary Noam said that she was engaged in domestic terrorism, that Ms. Good was a domestic terrorism. J.D. Vance said, while you can accept that this woman's death is a tragedy, while acknowledging it is a tragedy of her own making, blaming the victim. As I said, I can give you now close to 10 reasons why these are blatant, provable lies. Just recently, after the initial clip, the administration released a new clip which portrayed some of the things that happened before the incident that led to her shooting death. And it clearly disproves the idea that she was engaged in an act of domestic terrorism. Quite the contrary. She was sitting in her vehicle with the window rolled down, totally calm, with a dog in the back who was also totally calm, stuffed animals for her child, and she engaged in very good-natured, calm banter with ICE agents saying, I am not mad at you. Not the slightest indication that she was engaged in any kind of act of domestic terrorism. Come on. Can't even pass the most minimal kind of smell test. So that is problem number one with what they are alleging. Problem number two is that the officer may or may not have been slightly hit. We'll get to that in a moment. But clearly, whatever you may think of the first shot, and I'll explain why even the first shot was unjustified, but leave that aside for a moment. The second and third shots are inexplicable as acts of self-defense, as the administration claims. Rather, these shots were fired when the officer was already on the side of the vehicle. Get that. On the side, was not in the path of the vehicle, was in no danger. No other ICE officer was in any danger, and the vehicle was clearly moving away from him. He then took a shooter's stance, very deliberately, a double-hand shooter stance, pointed at the window, and fired 2 shots, point blank, into her face.
I'm not sure if he had 2 hands on the gun because he was recording with one hand.
It looked like he had 2 hands, but again, the video doesn't matter. Clearly, he's pointing the gun right point blank at an open window with no one in any danger, already on the side of the car clearly moving away from him, and fires 2 shots into her face. We don't know, we may never know, because the Justice Department, FBI, has taken over the investigation, not allowed local officials. Even the Civil Rights Division is not allowed, in the Department of Justice, is not allowed to investigate this. Only Kash Patel's FBI. Is Kash Patel an honest broker, Sam?
No.
No. He was a longtime Trump loyalist, picked not because he had any qualifications, but because he would do whatever Trump wanted him to do. I'm astounded how few commentators have focused on the second and third shots. No matter how you want to spin it, no matter what you want to claim, there is not an iota of evidence indicating that the second and third shots were nothing more than deliberate murder. They were not fired for the officer's safety. They were not fired for anyone else's safety. And also, as I will explain later, they were also in direct violation of Department of Justice guidelines on the use of force. Next point, this video, which they claimed, justified their knee-jerk reaction, but in fact contradicted it, had a very important piece of audio right after the shooting. Do you know what that was, Sam?
He said, F that B word or something like that?
Effing bitch.
Oh, yeah.
Effing bitch. Now, does that suggest to you an officer in control of his emotions, acting totally professionally, and having no animus against this woman?
No, it does not suggest
it is
that.
Absolutely the opposite, and it is incredibly damning. Plus, let's unpack this idea that she viciously tried to ram the officer. First of all, that new video, which is totally damning for Trump, and Noam and Vance, although they claim it's exculpatory, showed him before the escalation going in front of the car. If she wanted to ram him, that was the point at which she would have rammed him. Secondly, the video does not show, none of the videos, that she was driving in a way to viciously and willfully ram him. Whatever he may subjectively have thought, the objective evidence shows which way was she moving her car, Sam?
She was turning her wheels away from the officer.
She was turning her wheels away from the officer. Exactly the opposite of what you would be doing if Trump was right in claiming that she was violently, willfully, and viciously running over the ICE officer. Next, let's look at the claim that it's hard to believe he is alive, according to Trump, after this vicious, willful attack. What did the officer do, Sam, after he killed the woman?
He fled the scene.
He fled the scene. He walked away. Was there the slightest indication that he was even suffering from the most minor of injuries?
It's hard to say. I'm not a doctor.
I know you're not a doctor, but just from a layperson's point of view.
From my point of view, I didn't notice anything, no.
Right. I didn't notice a thing. He had a spring in his step. There was no sign of pain on his phone, on his face. No blood, no nothing. This did not, certainly, even if he might have had some minor injuries, Sam, his steps were certainly not indicative of someone who it's hard to believe he's alive, right?
Yeah, I did not get that from that video at all.
No one has gotten that from that video. And they claim, they sent him to the hospital. We know he was very quickly released. If he was at death's door, that wouldn't happen. And what information have they released to us about what the hospital found?
I haven't heard anything.
Nothing. And that's another point. The ones I've been talking about so far are direct, but circumstantially, another indication that they are making up stories is that they've shut out local law enforcement, state and city, and only put the investigation in the hands of the Trump loyalists, Kash Patel. If they had nothing to hide, and, everything they said was right. She viciously attacked him. He fired in self-defense. It was all legitimate. Why shut out the state and local officials? That is not standard practice. In the George Floyd incident, for example, both the state local and federal officials were involved. And they, both have different expertise. And it is very important to involve as many agencies as you possibly can. And also the civil rights operation routinely investigates these kinds of incidents, and they were completely shut out also. Now, what I now want to look at is, the claim that everything he did was legitimate. He was following his training. This was consistent, with what he is trained to do. What, in fact, are the DOJ guidelines, Department of Justice guidelines, on what you should do in dealing with a vehicle stop and what you shouldn't do in terms of where the officers should be positioned? The answer is, here it is, officer positioning. The officer may approach either side of the stopped vehicle for safety reasons. It is not in their training. In fact, it is directly contrary in their training to stand in front of a potentially moving vehicle. Not only is that, an official federal guideline, Sam, it's common sense. When I take an Uber and the Uber lets me out, I never walk in front of the vehicle. I always walk in the back. You never know when a vehicle is going to move. So it is totally contrary to the officer's training to ever be in front of the vehicle.
I think you can argue, actually, that he put himself into harm's way.
Clearly he did, in violation of his, I don't know how he was trained, but in violation of crystal clear Department of Justice guidelines. And obviously a direct contradiction, forget the guidelines, to what everyone knows: you never stand in front.
It doesn't make any sense to me, even from just a standard law enforcement approach, because he had walked around the vehicle once and he was back at his car.
Right.
And he went then again in front of the vehicle. He could have stayed on the right side of the vehicle. Renee Good's partner was on that side if he was trying to, again, whatever he was trying to do.
We don't know what he was trying to do, but
him stepping in front of the vehicle, to me, is him putting himself in harm's way.
Yeah. And contrary to what he supposedly is trained to do, and contrary to the most elementary common sense. Next guideline: firearms shall not be discharged to disable moving vehicles. Deadly force is permitted only when an officer reasonably believes a person in the vehicle poses an imminent threat of death or serious physical injury to the officer or others, and no other reasonable alternative exists. Well, this guy is holding his cell phone, right? Holding his gun, fires his gun, and is still easily able to move out of the way of the vehicle, right? He's clear of the vehicle, and instead of following the guidelines, which says you only fire if you're in imminent threat of death, he's already on the side of the car. Not only isn't he in threat of death, he's not in threat of death of anything, and he's firing 2 point-blank shots at her, clearly acting totally in violation to the crystal clear protocols of the federal government.
And there's no way, again, Kristi Noem has said over and over again that he was, following his training perfectly and to a T and blah, blah, blah. There is no way they teach law enforcement officers to hold a gun in one hand and hold a phone in another. No shot that is part of typical training.
Especially if you're walking around in front of a vehicle.
Regardless,
you don't do that.
There's no way they teach law enforcement officers to hold a gun in one hand and a phone in another. There's no way.
It also notes one reason why you never fire into a moving vehicle is because if you disable or kill the driver, you are putting in jeopardy every person around the situation.
Right. I've been seeing a few former law enforcement folks talking about that. For a long time, you weren't allowed to fire at a moving vehicle at all. that changed after in certain terror attacks, like in Charlottesville, New Orleans, certain terror attacks in Europe, where people were ramming through crowds with their vehicle.
Right.
They changed that a little bit, but not entirely.
Just a little bit, exactly, to deal with really tremendously escalated, deadly situations. Nothing like what was going on here. Next point. The officer, on his own, leaves the scene.
That was so crazy.
Disappears.
I saw that live the other day when I was going live on this channel. I saw that live, and I was in real time shocked to watch this guy just drive off after shooting somebody in the face. It was shocking.
Totally against protocol. Once again, if you're involved in an officer-involved shooting, you're supposed to wait for a supervisor, give a brief statement, and have the supervisor escort you from the scene. You are not supposed to just, on your own volition, disappear the way this guy did. Again, I've lost count of, how many violations of basic common sense and crystal clear guidelines for officers. Another guideline. Officers will be trained in and must recognize and act upon the affirmative duty to request and/or render medical aid as appropriate where needed. Did they follow that guideline, Sam?
No.
Absolutely not. Not only did they not even check on her, even though they're supposed to be trained, at least to some extent, in medical aid, but there was a doctor, a physician, on the scene who said, "I am a physician. Let me check her." And you know what they said? "We don't care." And so they delayed at least another 15 minutes until the medics arrived. And then they had another big problem. You know what that was with the arrival of the ambulance? It was blocked. They had so many ICE vehicles, surrounding the scene that the ambulance could not get through. Multiple ways violating the clear Department of Justice mandate to request and/or render medical aid. And by the way, in terms of this blockage, she was not blocking the access of ICE vehicles to the road. We saw in the videos vehicles easily, right, Sam, swerving around her and continuing on the road, including at least one ICE vehicle. So it is totally unclear why they escalated this situation in the first place. She wasn't an immigrant. She wasn't certainly an undocumented immigrant. They had no jurisdiction over her. She wasn't impeding their operations. She wasn't committing a crime. This whole thing was not escalated by her committing some act of domestic terrorism, but by the ICE officials themselves. Now, there is a history of ICE claiming attacks on ICE officers justifying a violent response that turned out, like this, to be lies. One famous incident involved Greg Bovino, top official in charge of ICE patrol. Contrary to a court order, he threw a tear gas canister on protesters. He claimed, "I did this because a protester fired a rock at me and hit me in the head." Well, it turned out he didn't know it. There was video, and guess what, Sam?
Tell me, Dad.
That never
I think you
happened.
ask me a question every 30 seconds. I think you should just go.
Flow.
Yeah, just go.
That never happened. No rock was fired and hit him in the head prior to his firing the tear gas at the protesters. And they finally had to admit, yeah, we were lying about this. This just wasn't true. Then in Chicago, a few weeks ago, there was an incident almost identical to that which came down in Minnesota. Let me see if I can find my papers on this. I know I have it. And if I don't, I can give it to you by memory. Here it is. In Chicago, a woman suffered multiple bullet wounds when they were claiming, again, that she was using her vehicle to attack ICE agents. Well, she suffered multiple bullet wounds from 5 rounds, imagine that, and survived. And just like the effing bitch, there was a very damning statement from the officer who shot her. He reportedly sent a message saying, quote, according to media reports, "I fired 5 rounds and she had 7 holes. Put that in your book, boys." And guess what? To the charge that she was engaged in vehicle assault on the officers, what happened to that? All charges were dropped. They were unable to sustain any case against her. And throughout, you would think officers are, constantly being victims of deadly force to listen to Kristi Noem and other administration officials. In fact, throughout 2025, zero, I repeat, 0 ICE officials were killed in pursuit of their duties. Contrarily, they fired something on the order of 15 shots at 15 or 16 persons, killed 4 of them, and 32 persons died in ICE custody. That's over 30-0. And not only do we have these 2 blatant cases of officials lying, but it turns out most cases brought against supposed persons who were assaulting ICE officials either fell apart or resulted in acquittals. Very, very few convictions or guilty pleas of anyone going after ICE agents, contrary to the portrayal by Trump officials. So you got to put these lies in the context of a history of lying in other and similar incidents. Now, the other thing, Sam.
Yeah.
You ready?
Yeah.
Are they fooling the American people?
No, I said that last week. I said I don't think the American people are buying this. We see the videos, and there's been, even since Renee Good in Minneapolis, there's been dozens of videos that you can see of ICE going way too far. And, Americans are watching this unfold. These mass armed federal agents essentially, saturating an entire city. The American people can see this. You can't gaslight them.
No, American people, Trump said, don't believe what you see or hear, only believe what I tell you. That's totally Orwellian, but it's not working anymore. This is the most recent poll, Yahoo YouGov poll, independent, nonpartisan poll. Only 27%, barely over a quarter,
Move your feet a little bit that way. Okay, better.
Think that the shooting in Minneapolis was justified. 52% think it was not. That's a 25-point gap. I repeat, a 25 percentage point gap. Then there was a small number who weren't sure. Not everyone has seen the videos. About 20% of Americans didn't see it. And it gets worse than that in terms of the people's evaluation of what Trump is doing with ICE. They were asked, has ICE raids in major U.S. cities done more harm than good? Okay. 54% said more harm than good, as compared to only 34% who said more good than harm. That's a 20 percentage point gap. That is, pretty amazing. And those who think it was justified are almost totally driven by Republicans. But what's interesting, even though a very substantial majority of Republicans think it was justified, the polarization on this issue is not nearly as great as you normally see between Republicans and Democrats. Only 70% of Republicans think that ICE does more good than harm. 30% either weren't sure or think ICE did more harm than good. That's extraordinary, cracking of the Republican base that you don't normally see. And that's not just on the shooting, that's on overall ICE policy. And this was supposed to be Trump's signature issue, his issue that, would drive his approval, would drive Republicans to win the midterms.
He's going too far. The American public can see it. He's going way too far.
Yeah, I want to read something from an eyewitness in Minneapolis, Greg Boulanger. I mentioned him before, a former teacher of the year. He said, "Friends outside Minnesota, you need to know what is happening here. Aside from the shooting, ICE agents are cruising areas with immigrant-owned businesses and kidnapping patrons and employees alike. Yesterday, they abducted 2 U.S. citizen employees at a suburban Target, one of whom was begging to allow him to get his passport to show them." This is not anywhere near the first incident of ICE agents detaining and roughing up even U.S. citizens and keeping them in custody, at least for some time. ICE is targeting schools and school buses. They pepper sprayed teenagers and abducted 2 school staff members at the high school up the street from me. Police are literally escorting school buses to ensure that children can get to school and home safely. The Minneapolis public schools, get this, Sam, have moved to virtual learning for the next 4 weeks. We haven't seen that since the pandemic. ICE is targeting hospitals and clinics. Patients are scared and are canceling their appointments or just not showing up. Kids are missing their checkups and vaccines. Folks aren't getting their care. They are smashing windows in cars and homes. They are arresting and sometimes beating legal observers. A friend of a friend had her arms broken yesterday. I can go on and on and on. It's a lengthy, single-spaced 2 pages indictment of the brutal tactics in Minneapolis. And instead of backing off and trying to curb this and calm down tensions, ICE is ratcheting it up under orders from Trump and Nome. They're doubling down, sending 1,000 more ICE agents to Minneapolis. Now, the cynic in me says this is all planned. This is what they want. They want to cause chaos. They want to cause violence. They want protesters to engage in violence for the simple reason that they want justification for either invoking the Insurrection Act or declaring martial law, particularly in advance of the 2026 elections. That's why officials in Minneapolis and Minnesota and elsewhere are warning protesters, don't fall into the trap. Stay as peaceful as possible. Don't engage in violence. As I said, when it comes to Trump and his administration, the word hypocrisy is too weak. You pointed out the contrast between how they regarded Ashley Babbitt and how they regarded Renee Good. Do you want to enlighten us about that?
I said that?
You said that. You said it was totally different.
No, they're using the same logic that you would use to defend Renee Good. They use the same logic for Ashley Babbitt.
No, they use the opposite logic.
No.
Let me finish. They say Ashley Babbitt was a patriot. She was acting patriotically when she was breaking the law, not heeding law enforcement instructions, and illegally trying to break into the U.S. Capitol. Right. There was no question that she was engaged in illegal action, whereas Renee Good was not doing anything illegal. And yet they celebrate Ashley Babbitt as a patriot, and they denigrate Renee Good as a domestic terrorist.
I also want to add, and I can't stress this enough, and this is something that I don't see the mainstream media talking about or pushing back on. I don't even see a lot of YouTube commenters or YouTube commentators talking about this. The entire justification for ICE is built on a house of lies and myths about undocumented folks and immigrants. Undocumented folks and immigrants are less violent than native-born Americans. They don't pose a threat to the economy. They don't pose a threat to the job market. They don't pose a threat to the housing market. And there is heaps upon heaps of data and evidence to prove each and every one of those points. And I don't know why more people, again, aren't pushing back with this fact, why people don't talk about it. The entire justification of ICE is built on a house of lies. Things made up by Trump, things made up by his administration. They have been fear-mongering immigrants for a decade now, and the majority of the claims they make about the undocumented folks in America are wrong, empirically wrong. So this idea that ICE is here to keep us safe is a lie, because undocumented immigrants and migrants and immigrant communities in general commit less violent crimes than Native Americans. I mean,
by a wide margin. And there's a good reason. They don't want to get involved in the criminal justice system.
But I don't understand why more people in the media aren't talking about that. That the entire justification, safety, crime, it's all bullshit. Yeah. It's all nonsense. And there is study after study proving the Trump administration wrong.
And they can just the other day, Trump is talking about, we're picking up these people sent from the asylums, from the prisons, the killers. Well, there's data on that too, which totally tells us they're lying about picking up the worst of the worst. Over 70% of those detained by ICE have zero criminal convictions, zero. And most of the rest have convictions only for minor infractions like traffic violations, like driving without a valid license or a broken tailgate or making an illegal left turn. A minuscule percentage are serious criminals who are probably already in jail and posing no threat.
That was the next point I was going to make, is that, they keep talking about these murderers and rapists and child predators, right? Those people are processed through normal law enforcement means. I don't even understand the exact process that they're talking about when they're saying they're going after murderers. The Minnesota State Police and the Minneapolis City Police are supposed to be going after murderers, right? And if a murderer happens to be undocumented, then ICE comes in. And once they go through trial, are convicted, they can be deported. So I don't even understand the theory of justice that they are explaining through ICE, saying that ICE is going and collecting murderers. Murderers are part of normal law enforcement activities.
Yes. And by the way, Obama deported 3 million people, a lot of people who shouldn't be here, without having to go through all of the viciousness, the disruption, the chaos, the terror of ICE. It is totally unnecessary.
I have a whole video on my channel about the myths behind undocumented folks and the myths and the lies that this administration tells about undocumented folks. If you want to check it out and share it, I recommend it. The other thing I've been thinking about lately is, if you look at the states in the 2024 election which voted for Trump in the highest percentages, places like North Dakota, South Dakota, West Virginia, Kentucky, Arkansas, right? They are also the states that have the smallest immigrant and undocumented communities, right? So he spent a decade fear-mongering immigrants to these communities that don't have much contact with undocumented folk or immigrants, or especially a lot less contact than states like New York, California, Illinois, Florida, etc. He's convinced them that you should be scared of immigrants, right? They vote for him in really high percentages, right? The states that didn't vote for him, Minnesota, Illinois, California, are feeling the brunt of that fear-mongering. So communities that have a lot of contact with undocumented folks, have a lot of contact with immigrants, realize that the fear-mongering Trump is doing is complete bullshit. They don't vote for him, but they feel the brunt of people who have less contact with undocumented folks and immigrants, who have been brainwashed to believe this fear-mongering. It's sad.
Yeah. One other point. Top prosecutors in the office of the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office have resigned over the way in which the Justice Department under Trump is handling the investigation into the homicide of Renee Good. The top prosecutor for fraud, and Trump is saying, we got to be in Minnesota because of fraud. He resigned along with 5 other senior members of the U.S. Attorney's Office. These are either Trump appointees or career prosecutors. They're not, some gang of lunatic left-wingers. Similarly, according to several media outlets, there was a wave of resignations by career prosecutors in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department because they broke standard practice and refused to launch a civil rights investigation into this killing. So the whole thing is being cabined under Trump loyalist Kash Patel, who I suspect is spending more time trying to smear Renee Good as some kind of deranged left-wing terrorist than actually investigating the circumstances of the shooting.
We better get on to some other topics.
Okay. Or questions?
Well, I don't know. We've done one topic so far.
Yeah, but that's the big one. Let's just do 2 more.
All right.
Quickly.
Well, this next topic, I'm gleaning from 2 donations. So these were donations from Harry Chittenden and Coach T International about Iran, which is one of our main topics tonight. What are your thoughts on the ongoing protests in Iran? The regime is arguably at its weakest point since its foundation, and some say it could collapse in the coming weeks, especially with U.S./Israeli intervention. What then?
Look, Iran has always been a country of 2 faces. On the one hand, it has been a very, very modern, progressive, sophisticated, secular society. On the other hand, it has been a theocratically directed Islamic nation. And we're seeing those 2 sides of Iran clashing with one another. And obviously, my own proclivities side with the protesters and those who are against the tyrannical rule of the theocrats. But I find it the height of hypocrisy, and I said the word is too weak. On the one hand, Trump is so solicitous about the protesters in Iraq, and yet...
In Iran,
and yet so detrimental towards any kind of protests in the United States.
I know, it seems like he supports the protesters in Iran more than he supports Americans.
Oh, very much so. In fact, he doesn't support American protesters at all. He calls them terrorists, advocates. At one point, it didn't come into effect, shooting them in the legs. He at one point repeated a racist comment back from the Jim Crow era. When the looting starts, that's when the shooting starts. That's, his attitude towards American protesters. I don't support American intervention, though, militarily. I think there are other ways to support the protests. We saw what happened with American military intervention in Venezuela. Did that loosen the grip of the tyrannical regime and move Venezuela into a functioning democracy?
No, his vice president's now president.
Right,
Maduro.
and according to reports, the repression, the crackdown is even worse than it was before Maduro, and Trump doesn't care. He seems to care about only one thing in Venezuela, and that's its oil. Maybe the same thing in Iran.
Do you think they can actually possibly topple this regime?
I do.
You do?
I'm not predicting it, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. There just seems to be such a groundswell of opposition, and the leadership is very, very weak.
I've heard reports that there could be thousands of dead Iranians at this point.
We don't know. I mean, the official total that I've seen is 500, but it could be much larger.
My heart breaks for those people that lost their lives in Iran, and I hope I hope the Iranian people are able to topple this regime and get some of the basic freedoms that they deserve back.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, there was a time when Iran was one of the most progressive, modern nations in the region.
All right.
It has an illustrious history.
We have time for maybe one more topic. What do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about Jerome Powell, the EPA?
EPA.
Okay. The New York Times reports that the EPA plans to stop counting lives saved when setting air pollution standards, a move critics say weakens public health protections.
I've always said so many times, there's so much evidence, it's overwhelming, that Trump is, the most phony populist we've ever seen, more phony than a $3 bill. When you look at what he actually does, he is the wet dream of American business, particularly extractive industries, fossil fuel burning industries, polluting industries. He's already weakened or abolished many environmental protection measures designed to safeguard your health. And this is the most blatant, the most horrific at all. Basically, he has said in black and white, this is not an interpretation, that your life doesn't count. You don't matter. We are not going to consider the cost of American lives in evaluating our environmental standards. We're only going to consider the economic costs. We're only going to consider how it affects my rich friends.
All right, with that, we will move on to the question portion of the show. We have over 1,200 people watching, but only 500 likes. Make sure you like the stream. It helps us a lot. We are very close to 180,000 subscribers. So if you're tuned in now or in the recording, if you're watching this as a recording, please make sure you subscribe. Let's try to hit 180,000 followers within the next few days. That would be great.
That would be great. Go ahead.
I was going to go to our first question.
No, I was going to say, and don't forget, become a member. Costs less than a milkshake and is much healthier. And we always welcome the donations. There's a lot that goes into this. It's not just us getting on randomly and, talking for an hour.
I also want to give a quick shout out to our mods in the chat. I see you guys doing a lot of work in the chat. Thank you. I saw some people hating on the mods. I've been seeing the mods doing Herculean work in the chat tonight. So thank you to the mods. Our first question. How close are we to a situation like Bleeding Kansas in the wake of the ICE murders? Because my personal prediction is eventually someone fires back.
I think so. I'm not sure. Bleeding Kansas is what happened after Congress adopted popular sovereignty to deal with slavery in the 1850s, that the residents of the territories would decide for themselves whether the territory should be slave or free. And that led to bloody warfare in the Kansas-Nebraska territories between pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, but I am really fearful of escalating violence. And that's a really cautionary tale for us all.
What do you think of lawsuits against Noam and Hegseth? Even though the president is immune from civil lawsuits, are cabinet members protected? If not, do you think Hegseth and Noam will be removed or impeached?
They cabinet members do not have the same kind of broad immunity that the Supreme Court gave to presidents for criminal activities. Still, it is very, very difficult to sue the federal government or federal officials or to prosecute them for crimes, although it's been done. So I absolutely encourage every possible lawsuit against Hegseth, Noam, or any other officials involved in violating your rights. The more the merrier, in my view. I don't think either will get impeached as long as the Republicans control Congress, which I think will end after the midterms. And if they're still around, and they may not be, I suspect Noam will not last that long. Hegseth might. Then I think there is a fair chance of impeachment, but virtually zero chance of conviction in the Senate, where it takes 2/3 vote.
This is from Nan B. They say, it's time for Congress to stop Trump before it's too late. They have the power to do so. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Who has been AWOL in the first year of the Trump administration? The Congress. Harry Truman in 1948 campaigned against the so-called do-nothing Republican Congress. Well, compared to this Congress, that Congress, Republican Congress back then, was the do-everything Congress. This is probably the worst Congress, or certainly, in modern history, the worst Congress that we have seen, totally abdicating its responsibility as an independent branch of government. And by the way, the first branch, Article 1, is the Congress. Article 2 is the executive.
Mom just donated $20. She said Trumpocracy is the new term for hypocrisy.
What do they call it?
Trumpocracy.
Do you like that?
No.
No.
This is from Ben Vegan. How can democratic legitimacy survive when the vice president prejudices the outcome and attacks the press the next day, while Minnesota says it can't access key evidence or interviews as the federal government runs the investigation alone? What strategic purpose does rushing to lock in a, quote, law and order narrative serve before the facts are in?
It's we spent a whole half hour on that. It's gaslighting. That's all it is. It is absolutely an effort to try to imprint upon us a series of self-serving, self-justifying lies, as patent as they are. But I do think, the American people are finally beginning to see through not only that Trump and his cronies lie, but they lie in very damaging, very significant ways. The polling is really pretty damning for Trump and Noam and Vance and the whole crew. Noam's approval rating, I think, is a miserable 36%. And that's just the Trump loyalists, pretty much.
Our good friend Patrick Murray, they say. In his inauguration speech, Trump said he is bringing back manifest destiny. After the attacks on Venezuela, he has hinted at other places such as Greenland, Cuba, and even Mars. Can you explain manifest destiny and what countries are not safe?
Manifest destiny was an idea developed first by journalists and then picked up by politicians like President James K. Polk in the 1840s, that America had a destiny to expand across the continent from sea to sea. It actually goes back to, not necessarily in those words, but to original ideas developed by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson about the destiny of white Christian civilization to expand across North America. Never mind the indigenous peoples who already occupied those territories, or the millions of enslaved peoples who had no say in it. But Manifest Destiny did not extend to imperialism. It did not extend to intervening in sovereign nations outside the United States or acquiring imperial territory. That was something that began later with McKinley's smash and grab of the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Pacific Islands after the Spanish-American War, which was just ostensibly designed to free Cuba from Spanish rule, and then with the gunboat diplomacy of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, or the missionary diplomacy of Woodrow Wilson.
Don't forget to like the stream. We have 2,200 people watching, 700 likes. Let's see if we can get to
1,200 people.
What did I say?
2,200. Let's get up to
That'd be
2,200.
cool. We got to 2,200. And don't forget to subscribe because we're trying to hit 180,000 subscribers soon.
We're close.
This is from Axel Moreno. They say, can we give the Ford worker that called Trump a pedophile protector a round of applause? Given Trump gave the bird to him, it really shows that the early bird gets the pedophile. But in all seriousness, did you see the video? Any thoughts on a president flicking off a U.S. citizen expressing their thoughts about him?
I didn't see the video, but Trump does not recognize as legitimate anyone who criticizes him, even in the mildest way, much less something this extreme. Did you see the video?
No, I hadn't heard about it.
But I'm not surprised.
This is from Comic Fan. They say, do you think all that's happening in Minneapolis and Minnesota will turn the social unrest key?
I think it has a real chance. Obviously, it's too early to say, but if this spreads across the nation in this kind of violent, chaotic way, it certainly could. I'm monitoring it.
Thanks for monitoring it, Dad.
Why not? Who else is going to do it?
Right. This is from our good friend Alex Kawa. They say, I was elected last night as a committee member of my local Democratic Party.
Congrats.
Congrats. Do you think it's important for voters to see if there's a chance they can become officials for their local Dem party? And do you think it's a good vehicle for change?
Absolutely. You know, I've talked about this a lot. People have said, oh, you know, you're always criticizing. But I've also been constantly telling people positively what they can do. Vote. Organize others to vote. Absolutely do so by joining your political party organization. I also recommended become an election official. They're really going to be needed to run this election properly and keep out illegitimate outside intervention. If you're a lawyer, join the team of lawyers that are designed to maintain the sanctity of our elections, or donate or contribute to organizations that do so.
Do you feel Mark Kelly could be a charismatic figure if he ran in 2028? Do you think the left is more likely to nominate a centrist or a far left candidate in 2026?
2028, I think they mean. Yeah. I'm not sure Mark Kelly is charismatic, although Trump is doing and Hegseth, everything in their power to elevate the guy who almost no one ever heard of, right? Prior to his being so illegitimately attacked.
I don't agree with you that no one's ever heard of Mark Kelly before the Hegseth thing. I think he was a VP candidate.
Yeah, you're probably right. But he still wasn't prominently mentioned at the top of contenders for 2028 and was not all that well known across the nation. So definitely his profile has been greatly elevated. You know, there's an old saying, if you're going to go after the king, you've got to kill the king. And they are far, far from killing King Kelly. All they're doing is making him stronger.
This is from Ishan Belmont. They say, this is a stretch for 28, but I think J.B. Pritzker is going to be the front runner for the Dems. Who do you think is in the lead right now for 2028?
Well, you know, with all due respect, that's not an especially meaningful inquiry. It's way too early to handicap 2028. Look, whoever heard of Barack Obama, 3 years out of the 2008 election?
He wasn't even a senator yet.
No, he was a state legislator in Illinois. Whoever heard of Jimmy Carter? I remember watching, I guess I'm dating myself, Jimmy Carter going on this program called What's My Line? We're supposed to guess who these guests are and what they do. And no one had heard of Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton. Donald Trump, although people had heard of him, wasn't even on the polling for prospective Republican candidates for 2016, a year or so before the election. So way too early to speculate on who it may be. And right now, no one is, anywhere near majority support in the polls. I think Newsom is leading, but somewhere with like 28% of Democratic identifiers. So who knows? We may be totally surprised, as we were with Trump and Obama and Clinton and Carter.
This is a $10 donation from Kelawan 86. They say, if Trump captures Greenland, would you give him the foreign success key? If SCOTUS lets him run for a third term, would you give him the incumbency key?
I have no idea. Again, the election's, 3 years away? Almost. All of these things are too speculative. And I don't like to speculate. Greenland, it would depend on how he acquired it, what the results were. It's the aftermath that usually determines the success of a venture, not the initial incursion.
This is a question from one of our mods. They say, why do you think the left in America seems to completely ignore the horrific crimes of the Iranian regime? There are credible reports out of Iran that the regime is using war weapons on its civilians in complete I
get it.
Okay.
It's a horrible, repressive regime. I often hear the left. What is the left? Who are we talking about? I don't know. I don't think prominent, leaving aside the left, prominent Democrats are whitewashing the Iranian regime. I certainly have not seen that.
It seems to me like I've been noticing, what I've at least been seeing online, is that there's a lot of prominent left-wing political commentators who seem to sort of pick and choose their outrage, right?
I think that's true, but it's not the mainstream liberals. It's not the leadership of the Democratic Party. It is the leadership of the Republican Party, though, that, excuses Putin and Xi and Orban and so many other horrific, so many other horrific dictators. And this is something that really bothers me on both sidism. On the one hand, you have the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, and then they'll dredge up some obscure left-winger who's no one's ever heard of and claim it's equivalent.
That's a fair point. This is from Philip H. They say, time for Dem leadership to start telling ICE, military, Trump cabinet they have an expiration date and will be held accountable. The cowardice of Schumer and the DNC leadership is appalling.
What have I said is the one sentence I've described for American politics, Sam?
Republicans have no principles. Democrats have no spine.
Yeah. So, this is nothing new, but I do think they're getting better. I do think the arrow is in the right direction, and they are showing some more fire than they have before.
How does ICE get away with breaking constitutional law during abductions? This administration is giving them carte blanche immunity. That's how.
Exactly. They're not, not only are they giving them immunity and carte blanche, they're justifying what they're doing. They're putting a positive spin on the violence and chaos being inflicted by ICE. And as I explained, my most cynical side says there is an awful reason for this, that they want violence, they want chaos to justify invoking the Insurrection Act or calling martial law, perhaps in the run-up to the 2026 elections.
All right, this will be our final question for the night. Is the U.S. reputation repairable? What happens if we alienate ourselves by angering our allies? I also want to follow up. One of my friends sent me a video from a Indian political commentator, and she was
East
saying...
Indian or American Indian?
East Indian. And she was saying that America has turned into a rogue state actor. What are your thoughts on the current U.S. reputation? Has America become a rogue state? I mean, we captured another country's president. We're talking about Greenland. We've started a trade war.
Yes. Not America, but certainly the Trump administration. Trump says we're finally respected around the world. No, we're hated around the world in a way, we haven't ever, to quote Trump, we haven't seen anything like this before. He has turned America into a pariah, just like his buddy Netanyahu has turned Israel into an international pariah. I always quote the great Disraeli, former late Prime Minister of Great Britain, who says finality is not a word we use in politics. So I wouldn't say forever our reputation is destroyed, but it's going to take a lot of repair.
All right, some quick shout-outs to donators. Jules Forever says, I truly appreciate this broadcast. Thank you, Mr. Lichtman. I will be ordering your book. Joanne Roberts says, no question, just a hello from Melbourne, Australia, and thank you for all of your knowledge and hard work. A $20 donation from Peaceful Resistor, $5 donation from Mama Brooke, who said, Sam did the best analysis on January 7th within hours of the tragedy of Renee Good. That is true. We did go live, and we scrutinized that video frame by frame. Randy Suvada, $20 donation. PVIII2125, thank you for your donation. A couple others, Limited Light, Thor, Vladimir Planton. Thank you all for your donations. We appreciate it. And thank you all for watching. And thank you all for being a part of this community. Dad, what are your final words to the people?
We're always watching, Donald Trump. We're not going to let you get away with your lies, your gaslighting the American people. We will continue to be vigilant and to the best of our ability to pursue the truth at all times.
Thank you, Dad. Thank you all who are watching, and good night.
Good night.